Hello, everyone. Can you hear us? People who are
Yep.
joining us remotely? Okay, great. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Prateek Nayak, and I'm representing here the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership from the University of Waterloo. So this is a roundtable, and welcome to the roundtable. So we will not have any presentation, so there is no worries about whether the presentation is going out well or not in a hybrid system. So the title of the session, as you may have already seen on the program, is Vulnerability to Viability Transitions, Transdisciplinary Approaches to Getting the Governance of Small-Scale Fisheries Right. We often hear stories around how small-scale fisheries are vulnerable. There are tons of material that has been written, and the vulnerability basically meaning that the susceptibility to being harmed. But at the same time, there is also a lot of material on how sustainability, resilience, and viability of small-scale fisheries can be achieved. So often we look at these two sets of literature, two sets of actions or practice and policy separately. One of the problems that exist is in itself the separation between the attempts to understand vulnerability and viability. So at the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership, we focus on both vulnerability and viability together. So our approach is to look at the transition or the move from vulnerability to viability within small-scale fisheries communities. And we think that one way to respond to vulnerability is to kind of look at both of them as connected to each other. So therefore our approach is V2V, which is vulnerability to viability, and we kind of look at both vulnerability and viability, not just in an economic sense, but also to include all aspects of fishers' lives. That could be cultural, political, environmental, ecological, and other aspects of that are important to human life. We of course focus and try to look at these concepts and these notions of vulnerability and viability within a larger human environmental system perspective, but also to kind of learn at multiple interactions within the governance system itself. Today the panel is going to focus on two things. One, what are different ways to understand this transition from vulnerability to viability? And the second one is, what are the key elements of these things and how can we start to kind of connect the dots in terms of transitioning from one V to the other. And for that, we have gathered a wonderful panel of 7 people, and their roles are very different. One set of panel members are going to talk about vulnerability and viability transitions from their own expertise, interests, and perspectives. And then we have 3 wonderful young scholars who are going to respond to that by commenting on what they hear from those speakers. So I'll briefly introduce our speakers before I hand it over to them. So the first speaker is going to be Jessica Blythe from Brock University. Jessica is associate professor in Brock, and Jessica's research focuses on social ecological change and the capacity that is required to respond to those changes. So very, very relevant to the topic. Our second panelist is going to be Ana Carolina Esteves Diaz. Ana is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo, working closely with B2B Global Partnership. And Ana's focus is on marine protected areas, well-being, vulnerability, viability, and tons of work that she has done in looking at these things within a human environment context itself in multiple places. Our third speaker is going to be Ratana Bagdi from Memorial University. Of course, that doesn't need an introduction here. We all know Ratana's work in small-scale fisheries to the extent that sometimes Ratana stands as synonymous to small-scale fisheries in many ways because of the work that he has done at all levels. And the mayor actually said levels this morning, which was very emphatic in its voice. So it is not only at one level small-scale fisheries exist, but multiple levels. She has touched through her work at all these levels of intervention and how to make small-scale fisheries viable. Our fourth speaker is going to be Dr. Derek Armitage from the University of Waterloo. Derek's work is primarily on looking and understanding environmental change, but also understanding environmental change through a governance approach. Of course, Derek again looks at all of those things, governance and environmental change, using multiple lenses that situates themselves within resilience, socio-ecological systems, and political ecology, and all of those kind of domains, but also multiple places that he works in, a strong partner and a member of Vulnerability Viability Global Partnership. Following their talks, we have 3 graduate students that are going to really comment on what they hear. Our first discussant is Natasha Sairo. Natasha is a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo, working within the B2B Global Partnership Project. Natasha's heart has been in genetics, fish genetics, but now she is looking at human dimensions of exactly what she did in her previous studies. So connecting pure natural science kind of genetics kind of studies with more social science and human dimensions. She's looking at keystone species from a human environment perspective. Second discussion is going to be Bhavishya Kania. Bhavishya is just about to finish his master's. Bhavishya came with a civil engineering background, where he would throw words like neural networks and all of those to confuse me, and then now he is kind of stepping into more human dimensions of that work, and he cannot talk about his research without connecting quantitative and qualitative kind of dimensions. So stepping into new domains, and his research is on building typology in using case studies, using IADAP as an approach that we heard from Ali this morning. And our third discussion is going to be Ruel Mia, who comes with a background of market, finance, and related kind of things that he did for his masters. But now he's stepping into the domain of governance, where he's trying to connect how governance can play a critical role in understanding all those kind of dimensions, and therefore connecting with vulnerability to that. So we have 7 people, and we're going to hear a lot. And so without taking any more time, I would invite Jessica to start, and then we'll go in that order, hearing from our 4 panelists, and then we'll move over to our 3 discussants. Jessica, will start with you. Each one gets 10 minutes, and the discussants have 5 minutes to respond to that. Please.
Thank you very much, Prateek, and thank you for joining us. It's so exciting to be here with all the like-minded thinkers and people who are passionate about small-scale fishing. So it's very, very good to be here. My name is Jessica Blythe, and without further ado, in December of last year, there was a very controversial paper published. It called for a moratorium on climate science. You might have read it. Its title is The Tragedy of Climate Science. It was published in Climate and Development. It was authored by Bruce Glamovic, Tim Smith, and Ian White, who have led and co-authored various of the IPCC reports, including the ocean reports. And essentially in the paper, they argued that after 40 plus years of climate science, the action is abysmal, and that the Science Society contract has been broken. And the Science Society contract is this assumption that many of us in academia work under, which is that with publicly funded money, we will produce research which increases knowledge and ultimately translates into real world beneficial changes for society, perceived by whoever. And so it was highly controversial because they said, since that is not happening, climate scientists need to go on strike and stop doing research. And I co-supervised a student with Tim Smith, and while the paper came out, it was chaos. He was getting called by the New York Times. And so in that spirit, and because Evan asked us to be bold, and that's what we're trying to do with the panel here, I wondered, more as a provocation than as a literal question, but what if we as social scientists in small-scale fisheries did the same thing? In that, what if we stopped or called a moratorium describing vulnerability? And what if we stopped describing low capacity and poor governance and all of these negative attributes, which we could argue have been well documented. So let me ground this a little bit in some theory and try and make sure that I stay focused on the task for the panel today. Is we're trying to sort of identify what are conditions that enable this transition from vulnerability to viability. And I've read and been inspired by a lot of the writing on transformations and transitions. And if I synthesize a lot of the various thinkers' work, and so thinking about, Per Olsen and researchers from the Stockholm Resilience Center, Naomi Klein and her work in the Leap Manifesto, thinkers like Frank Fields and the socio-technical transitions. A lot of the theory that's written about transformation says that we need these two steps in order to effect transitions or large-scale transformations. The first is that we need to diagnose what are the root causes of the problems that we're trying to address. So what are the root causes of vulnerability? And trying to be provocative, I'm arguing that maybe we've done that, and we have a really good grasp on what are the causes that underlie vulnerability of small-scale fisheries. We've heard about a lot of them this morning, and I think we probably agree on many of them. Capitalism was thrown around a lot this morning, colonialism, corporate accumulation of profit and power imbalances, and so trying to think, critically and sort of in a bold space. What if we put that aside, and instead what we do to help facilitate this transition is really focus more on the second step, which is describing viable alternatives. And I think that a lot of the work that many of you have written that I take inspiration from describes these grassroots local initiatives of small-scale communities and small-scale fishery communities in particular that are incredibly strong and that show leadership and show innovation and agency through to all these various shocks. So let me just take the example of Pacific Island small-scale fisheries to sort of walk through what that could look like and what we know that does look like. I was really fortunate to work in Solomon Islands for 4 years during my postdoctoral research. And so we know that for tens of thousands of years, Pacific Islanders have been incredibly successful at small-scale fisheries management. We know that, actually, fun fact, you may know that the word taboo comes from the Fijian word taboo. And in the mid-1700s, when James Cook was voyaging through the Pacific Islands, he heard them using that word and he brought it back to England, and then it sort of infiltrated Western language. And we use the word now from that original Fijian meaning, which was prohibited. And so the way, and this is a simplification, that traditional Pacific Island communities managed their reefs was the reef that was adjacent to the community was in the management of that community. And one of the very effective methods that they used was declaring a reef taboo, which meant off limits. And then at a certain point in time, it would be opened and harvested and then closed again. And that's periodically harvested closures, but it's one of the really effective techniques. So fast forward 200 years later, and in the 1970s, the work of Robert Johannes really became quite famous for his work on describing these incredibly effective fisheries management techniques that have been used in the Pacific for hundreds and tens of thousands of years. And his book was called Words of the Lagoon, and it was based on 16 months of fieldwork in Palau, and he showed the real sort of complexity and sophistication of these management techniques that were based on seasonal spawning aggregations and lunar cycles and all kinds of complex knowledge. And that fisheries management systems in the Pacific are robust to contemporary challenges also. So there was a recent paper published by Carolyn Ferguson, who also worked in Palau, and she describes in 2011 a loophole in the legal system was exploited to allow 5 foreign companies to come in and start exporting sea cucumbers. Sea cucumbers are sedentary and very easy to exploit and overexploit if there's no regulation in place. So because these 5 companies were allowed to come in, there was a real high economic incentive to overexploit that fisheries. And again, those traditional fisheries managed practices were invoked. And one of the chiefs in the province that was being, or the state that was being most exploited, called a customary ban on exporting sea cucumbers, which through details that I will get wrong, turned into a legal ban in that state. And so the customary traditional management was used to kick out these 5 foreign companies, and that's a contemporary example. So, bring it back to the focus of the panel. If we're trying to identify conditions under which small-scale fisheries can switch from viability to vulnerability, I argue that maybe one of the things that social scientists can do is declare a moratorium on documenting vulnerabilities and instead use our platform, which is our key papers, if you know who knows how far they go, but to describe the already existing innovation, leadership, and agency in small-scale fishing. And I say that with a humongous caveat, and a point which Pratik made really importantly this morning is that in trying to highlight the power and agency and knowledge of coastal communities, I do not mean to shift the burden to adapt downwards. And so if we are advocating for developing decision-making authority and power to local communities, it has to be done in a way that is accompanied by the required resources. So it can't be just downshifting responsibility with no accompanying resources. But I guess I just bring it back to all the things that we've already heard this morning, which I love when Hannah said, there are great things going on and that are going right. And we heard from Tony, for example, about the really important work of fisheries meetings, and we heard about this intergenerational and traditional knowledge. So I challenge the panel that maybe declaring a moratorium on vulnerability and focusing on viability is one of the pathways forward.
Thank you, Jessica. This was a very interesting conversation, and while we were talking about this shift, I would like also to break this dichotomy between vulnerability and viability, and propose a discussion under the lens of well-being to think about that in this small-scale fishing sector. So this talk is to reflect on well-being dimensions of vulnerability and viability of small-scale fishing communities, and how a broad perspective on material, relational, and subjective aspects of well-being can be used to facilitate this process of getting small-scale fisheries governance right. And this is because governing small-scale fisheries comes together with implications to the fisheries sector, but also to the people that are involved in the fisheries sector. And well-being, we can understand well-being different ways. So there is this 3-dimensional definition of well-being, or concept of social well-being, that takes important considerations in the material, relational, and subjective aspects of well-being. So well-being also refers to being well with others. That brings this idea of social relations that is very important in the small-scale fisheries sector. Safe social relations also entails mechanisms to solve conflicts, for example. There's also the idea of having human needs met, that can refer to welfare, material well-being, but also social relations and subjective aspirations that one might have in one person's life. And having a meaningful life. I left that one can enjoy life satisfaction. So this is also related to how we perceive their lives. And well-being may then be characterized as 3 different dimensions: material, relational, and subjective. And this can bring some implications and different levels of vulnerability and viability, specifically in the small-scale fisheries sector. And in the small-scale fisheries, there are several vulnerabilities that are affecting people's well-being. But it's very interesting that from vulnerability, we can also have viabilities in dealing with those vulnerabilities, which show this connection between vulnerability and viability. And once we propose some actions towards viability, can also new vulnerabilities can emerge. So this is a very dynamic process. And I'll give you some examples on major vulnerabilities and some ways that examples of how countries are dealing with those vulnerabilities towards more viable small-scale fisheries. So vulnerability and viability of this transition can be understood in different domains. If we think, for example, in environmental vulnerabilities, we have climate change that is affecting safety at sea. for example, with stronger events or stronger and more frequent storms. We also have migration issues that migration of fish stocks, at the same time migration of fishing communities that could be displaced and live somewhere else due to environmental disasters, but also could go and fish in new areas, which bring new perspectives on social relations once people go and try to explore other fishing grounds. In the health domain, for instance, we have the COVID-19 pandemic that is being a major vulnerability, but it's also very interesting that countries like Japan was reporting that COVID-19 was also a major driver of economic viabilities, in the sense that local markets were open so that fishers could connect directly to consumers. So this was one way to deal with the economic losses that was happening during the pandemic. In the governance and management domain, for instance, we have illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries. That is also considered a major vulnerability, causing social and economic losses, also cultural losses. But on the other hand, these can also be seen as a coping mechanism once there are some regulations that are implemented and are not in line with local socioeconomic realities, and illegal fishing is then a way to cope with that. So these are some interconnections and some trade-offs that you can see in this vulnerability to viability concept and transition. And this can be detrimental, but also bring some insights on different aspects of well-being, material, relational, and subjective. And here I'd like to give an example of safety. Safety is a major human need that is related to well-being of fishing communities as well. And safety brings this perspective of how fisher inland and how fishing communities that are inland and fisheries at sea can be affected by vulnerabilities in their well-being, and also this could bring some insights on how to transition towards more viable fisheries. So thinking about safety, we can understand safety as being affected in the sea, for example, by piracy and robbery attacks at sea that is connected to the illegal, reported and unregulated fishing, mostly piracy attacks coming from illegal vessels. Also climate change, that with more stronger and more frequent disasters may affect the safety of fishers once they go out in the sea, but also can bring some infrastructure losses in the communities or inland. And there was one very interesting component of safety that was connected to landscape aspects as well, that is fishers, once they observe an area that is being deforested, they can predict if that might be more sensitive to landslides or to erosion, and that could bring some infrastructure losses and losses of lives in fishing communities as well. And this is a component of safety that was interesting to understand how the observation of ecological processes and the landscape can bring some insights on how to connect, for example, with conservation initiatives. And finally, social safety. So in the same areas, in fishing communities that are placed in remote areas, or they're around ranges of mountain chains or closed forest, for instance, the access to the communities is more restricted, and this brings an ambience of less violence and less robbery, which is an issue, and this is something very important in some fishing communities where they report to feel safe to pursue their life and their life satisfaction within their communities. And this integrates this aspect of land and sea that you're talking earlier this morning as well. That entails all these well-being components of people, and in this case, small-scale fisheries. And these are multiple vulnerabilities and some insights on viabilities that bring to the stake the material, social, and relational dimensions of well-being. And these brings us three main tools to deal to understand this dynamics between and transition from vulnerability to viability towards getting small-scale fisheries governance right. So first, well-being, and specifically this example regarding safety, shows these implications of different vulnerabilities and potential for viabilities emerging from them. Two small-scale fisheries that can help us to prioritize governance guidelines and governance directions. Second, well-being brings this interactive perspective of small-scale fisheries, connecting vulnerabilities in the water and outside of the water, thinking about the sector as a whole and bringing out some new implications. And finally, this also brings fisheries perception to the table, and accounting for these relevant human dimensions in small-scale fisheries that can really help to this transition towards more viable fisheries in a holistic and more broad perspectives. So these are some key insights on how well-being can be a useful lens to facilitate this transition from vulnerability to viability and getting small-scale fisheries governance right.
Thank you very much, Anna. You can already see that, so one is saying, a complete moratorium on vulnerability, and then I say, how can we do that? So it's a process, and vulnerabilities do emerge from ongoing work on viability. So interesting. We'll see where that goes. So we'll move on to Ratana, to you, to give your perspectives on the topic.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I usually don't agree to be the talk in an organized conference, but he convinced me, right, that this is going to be fun. It should not be just me talking about things. But the thing is, the title of the session actually has all the words that I like, and I can talk about that forever and ever. But I actually wanted to go line up there, be part of the discussion, because I started to feel like I want to say something about these moratorium things. You know why? Because when you think about it, we can put a moratorium on climate science for climate change. And they actually are saying, the conversation actually quite interesting. CDC ran just a story about these other things and said that what kind of science is it that is really needed? It turns out that a lot of people argue that maybe there's certain kind of science that should really be put on ice, whatever. But there's so many other kinds of science that still need it. And I think it's the same thing when you look at it. So I would hope that from our perspective, this is about going from a problem space to a solution space. But there is so many different ways to look at it. We understand problem from our own perspective. So being vulnerable, we can always lead to once, twice, or even more in our life. We always have there are people who feel vulnerable because of what they do and who they are. Now that is something that it would take a lot of effort for anyone who's not fishing to understand that. So the problems need to be understood in the context of how it's being affected. And this is the kind of things that we're trying to do when we talk about transdisciplinary research, when we talk about governance. We have this concept that we call a naked problem. And what it is that we might think that it's a familiar problem. We have seen this problem before. But when we think about it again, we realize that the problem is actually being perceived, received, understood very differently from one context to another. We see somebody understands the problem one way, and another person might actually talk about it. But who gets to define what vulnerability is and what it means to be vulnerable? It's not dissimilar to being poor. It's not dissimilar to being anything that we're not comfortable with. And we just have to learn how to live with that, even that uncomfortable. Because that pushes us a little bit to think about we don't want to feel. Nobody wants to feel that. And therefore, we need to open up that space creatively even for ourselves. And fishing people are doing that all the time. And we learn that from this moment. Right? Why do we need to do that? Why do we need to do change when they think they can talk about things? Still, the regulations and things that are imposing on them, there are a lot of demands on all of them, and all of us too, to try to figure it out how to move into solution space. From the wicked problem perspective, the solution space is also kind of wishy-washy. How do you know? Is there one solution really? Is there like one way to get there? How do you know that the problem has been solved? When it's kind of a moving target, because viability is also known as steady state. One time you might feel that, oh, feeling pretty okay, maybe I have everything I need. The next day I said, oh, maybe not. I don't feel well anymore. I don't think I like what's happening to me. So that can change points. So knowing that there might be what we call a stopping end. So that solution that we're trying to get to, you might not even know that there. Because of that. So when we look at this situation, it is very important, and it's from a governance perspective, to recognize that the people who need to define what the problem looks like, they need to be coming from those multiple perspectives. It's not fishing people, it's not government, it's not scientists. And how to agree, would there ever be a consensus? And that's what we are struggling with. Because most of the time, somebody always thinks they know more than the others. And then we forget also to recognize that, maybe we need to listen more. They're trying to say more about it. And that is actually a good sign. So stepping back a little bit and trying to really, this is about perspective, right? You can see from the outside in or inside. And I think that's a good exercise to get into. So I definitely don't want us to give up on talking about it or thinking that we move too quickly into another space where there might be solution, because going there too quickly without a full understanding of what it really means and affects people. And whether we really are on the same page or not yet with what we think we know. Until we do that, we're not going to do. And of course, when we start to talk about viability, it's kind of a nice thing to know that we might be able to get. And it's a lot better than because we always feel like we never catch up. And I think viability okay, because again, it's also part of what we call state of mind. There is subjective, elective, well-being, material, but at the same time, it's also about being recognized. It's about being accepted as, if I am happy with being a fishing person, and this is all I need to feel viable. But if somebody comes along and say that, for me to feel that I am, living in the most viable way and I have surrounded myself with people, it might look different. And how do you tend, how we work in this kind of complex situation and big problems around that to make sure that people really feel that, finally we get it right in terms of arranging the solutions, putting in the right regulations, coming up with good management policy that really can help move people there. But at the same time, we also be part of that act because it is the both space. So often we get criticized for not doing enough of that interaction. So interactive governance, which is work on, is actually really key on getting interactions and understanding. Because it is through that understanding of interactions with all the actors at all levels and scales, and throughout the whole process, we might get have more time, I could line up there.
Thanks very much for the articulation of, moving from a problem space to a solution space is really the roadmap in a way to move from vulnerability to viability, but also connect through the perspectives of well-being and whether we're doing this possible or not. Okay, so now we'll move on to Joel, your perspectives on that.
Super, yeah, thanks. That's a great discussion. And actually, hopefully, we segue from thinking about that problem to solution space and thinking about this idea of science, maybe actually replacing it with science with knowledge. We'll think a little bit more about that. So, I guess reflecting on sort of some of the diverse factors, and I'm also not going to use vulnerability as well, just do that. So, reflecting on one of those factors that actually helps us think about small-scale fisheries viability, I really want to talk about the intersection of co-management and this idea of knowledge co-production, which I think many of us are familiar with, and really pick up maybe on three things. One is a little bit about the co-management context we're working in, and then within that, thinking about knowledge co-production as a bit of a catalyst for dealing with some of these bigger problems that we do with project and overcoming some of those challenges, building opportunities for well-being. But then also end with a little bit of a cautionary note on this idea of knowledge co-production as well. And so we're thinking about viability of small-scale fisheries. We have an opportunity and need to reflect on these bigger governance processes and really think about the role of knowledge. What knowledge are we talking about? And think a little bit about the politics of knowledge as well. Whose knowledge, how is it being used, how are we drawing these knowledge systems together? And not really how the different knowledge systems being valued. And so that really does take us into the realm of this idea of co-production of knowledge, co-development of knowledge to help us hopefully get to some better outcomes. And so certainly in the context of the V2 partnership, this idea of governance is very important. And we're getting lessons from a lot of the individuals and the communities and the groups that are involved in that project. And there is clearly an interest in a recognition that we need forms of governance that are much more community-centered and collaborative. And we're talking about more community-centered governance is really where communities are taking that, as we've heard much today, communities are role. There's much more of a focus of privileging of issues of rights, of access and allocation within communities, cultural practices, emphasizing those, and also recognizing the importance of place-based knowledge. So these are the things that people understand and experience, and how these knowledges become the foundation for action and solutions to some of these challenges. And so I'm using the word community-centered somewhat deliberately. We've heard the terms community-based, and I think that's fundamental in community-based initiatives. But in the context of some of these drivers that we've talked about, like climate and market shifts and fluctuations, I think we need to be aware that communities aren't always able to navigate through that on their own. So it really does take us into the realm of co-management, building these vertical and horizontal linkages across scales that help us navigate changes and then take us into the realm of multi-level kind of approaches. And that's important, I think, for a number of different reasons, but one of the most important reasons for it is as we do build these sort of co-management arrangements, it really creates a context for learning and shared learning, or sometimes what we refer to as social learning, which is really about learning that goes beyond the individual. So all of us here together, learning about things in some new ways that individually we do, but as a collective, hopefully we're taking ourselves and challenging our assumptions, things like that. So these linkages and these learning processes, of course, are very much connected to the formations of networks and of different actors from communities, government agencies, and everything in between. And that's a site, of course, of a lot of information flows and communication and trust building and stuff like that. So that's why we need to be thinking about these multi-level governance processes. But of course, the challenge is how do we achieve that? How does it actually work? And what are some of the issues that we found our efforts to sort of support more viable small-scale fisheries? So I'll just pick up on a few of those points. And I guess the first thing I think we need to be thinking about, and I think we're hearing about, is that when it does come to these more multi-level types of arrangements and this notion of co-management, there is, I think, still somewhat of a policy vacuum and for how we can do this and how best to support it. We heard from the Director General from the DFO this morning about the importance of collaboration and advocating for that. And yet at the same time, I think we need to recognize that there is, even in the Canadian context, quite a significant policy vacuum. Co-management and this idea of shared decision-making and joint decision-making is very much a continuum from the more legal and enforceable kinds of arrangements that we see in the context of Northern Land Claims agreements to more informal and more non-binding types of arrangements. I think the issue is there's no blueprint for that. There's no necessarily one particular way that's going to do it. But in the context of how we reflect on these things, we're talking about more than consultation. We're talking about more than participation. What we're really thinking about here is trying to get a much more embedded and ways of making decisions that are really grounded in the context of shared decision making and shared responsibilities. But in many contexts, how that emerges still remains fairly ad hoc. And so in many co-management contexts, outside of the land claims and Canadian context, for example, it's still somewhat of a make it up as you go along, learning how to do things on the fly. And so I think that's something that is in the context of how we think about small-scale fisheries viability and in our partnership, lots of different jurisdictions, lots of different contexts, but there's an opportunity for us to think much more carefully about what sort of policy context enable this move towards small-scale fisheries viability. Now, co-management experiences are rich and varied, and generally there's lots of examples of some success and reductions in conflict and so on. But I still think this connection between the formation of some of these arrangements and social benefits and the links to ecological outcomes are still areas that we don't have a really good handle on. So we do need to take that systems perspective that Alida mentioned this morning as well. So as we're thinking about building these co-management arrangements and formations of these networks of decision-making, shared partnerships and learning and so on, and many ingredients for success, but time and again, when we sort of review these examples and hear about situations, both good and bad, the role of knowledge comes up, and knowledge processes and how knowledge is engaged in knowledge. So that really takes me to my second point, which is that in situations in co-management contexts where we see some success, knowledge co-production processes are often a catalyst for better outcomes, and for more viability. And so, when we think about this idea of knowledge co-production, we defined this some time back. So this idea of bringing a plurality of different types and sources of knowledge together to build a more systems-oriented perspective of the challenges and the big problems that we're confronting, with ideally some sort of, hopefully moving towards some sort of better outcomes and decision-making activities. And so in these contexts, the way they support co-management is because knowledge co-production inevitably provides us with more information, provides us with more perspectives on the complexities of the challenges, as was saying. Exposure to different value sets that we have to negotiate and work with as well. And so, this is all very positive in many respects. And so we're seeing lots more emphasis on this idea of co-production of knowledge in lots of different places now. In the IPPS process, for example, much more emphasis on this, and the IPCC process, much more emphasis on local knowledges and indigenous knowledges as well, in shaping those assessment processes. And I think for our purposes, the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science, all these endorsed projects, these are really meant to be sites, being presented as sites of knowledge co-production and knowledge co-creation. So these are all really valuable sort of trends and transitions in how we think about knowledge and good places to learn from. But I think one thing to keep in mind is as we do this, we tend to instrumentalize this idea of knowledge co-production. Just bring people together, everything will work out, and we sort of share our knowledge. We'll solve these problems, and that sounds great. So there's a very normative kind of instrumental way of action-oriented way of thinking about that. And I do think that's very valuable. But that brings me, I guess, just to my third point, for staying on time here, is that the rhetoric of knowledge co-production as a catalyst for co-management as well. I thought a bit about some of this as well. Sounds great, and I think we're making good progress. But there's still in many contexts an absence of what really meaningfully engaging with what the whole notion of knowledge and power really entails. And so I think there's an opportunity to do more of that, to think a little bit critically about that, and that certainly is a problem if we are thinking about the role of knowledge and knowledge co-production as a way to move towards small-scale fisheries viability in a meaningful way. Now, there are multiple reasons for that, why it's tricky. the whole, and it was brought up earlier, it's really hard to do. It's huge transaction costs, it takes a lot of time, investments, and resources, people's time, and so on. Make knowledge, the idea of knowledge production is challenging from the outset, and that point was made earlier among economies as well. And to respond to that, in some ways, this decade of ocean science project, which had much more of a 10-year time frame, may be a way to alleviate some of that, provide more long-term funding for these things. We can, of course, not fund initiatives in a way that really allow for some of these processes to unfold. Co-management takes on the order of 10 or more years to really develop some of those relationships and trust. So there is that notion. But I mean, beyond the investment in time and resources, I think we still have to confront the reality that many of our governance processes and co-management processes are still situated in very much a colonial kind of context and a suite of resource management practices that that have a colonial sort of foundation as well. And so I think KCP and the way we talk about KCP, we have to be a little bit cautious about it because it's certainly can drift into the realm of or be a site of some of these a site of co-optation if we're not careful. So we need and languages as well, as Steve Alex reminded us of earlier as well. So the idea of stock assessments and how we use fishery models and things to make decisions. There's lots of language around knowledge production and that, but these are fundamentally still colonial types of decision-making processes, and we need to grapple with that much more carefully because they are in tension with some of these other notions of small-scale fisheries, self-determination, and sovereignty, and data sovereignty as well. In many indigenous communities who may not wish to share some of the knowledge that they have, place-based knowledge as well. So these are all things that I think we need to just take a bit of a cautionary perspective on as we grapple with viability. Ultimately, I think for small-scale fisheries viability, knowledge co-production really is about disruption. You know, and it's at its best when it's disrupting things, disrupting the privileging of certain types of ways of knowing. Formal Western science, for example, disrupting how we think about decisions should be made in that more linear model, and essentially just disrupting some of those relationships that we've heard about throughout the day, which I found was really fascinating. These connections between colonialism, capitalism, fishery science, and what that means for small scale fisheries. So, yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jake. Co-management and co-production of knowledge, but not as a group. So that's the message. Okay, great. We'll open it up for questions and discussions from audience, but we'll first hear from our three discussions, very quick comments and reactions to what they heard. So we'll start with Natasha from you.
Okay. So thank you everyone for all of your insights. There was a lot going on there. And I just wanted to start with a little snippet of kind of what I was thinking about in relation to my work. So my background is in genetics, and one of the projects that I was working on that steered me away from that way of thinking was I was working on a skeleton called the fisheries, and tried to figure out how many fishers would need to be reintroduced into the Olympic National Park. And during that time, I kept thinking about what about the human impact, or where does that play a role in all of this research? And so I've come into the more social sciences world, and I've learned a lot during this time. And so my questions, I don't have comments, I have more questions, are all based on thinking about stuff from that perspective. So for Jessica, we talked about viability. One of the things that I was reflecting on was, can we only know that we've achieved viability once it's when we do backward thinking, once we're in the future and we look back at a time and say, oh, that was a really good time for fishers or the environment, or can we know we've achieved viability today? And then for Anna, your talk, I was thinking about how many dimensions are enough. So well-being, I never really thought about it that much till I started interacting with you, and that's so important. But I feel like in my past work, I've thought a lot about more financial aspects as opposed to happiness or well-being.
Rachana, I really liked when you said who is seeing a problem and who defines it, and this ability to capture all of the perspectives, and that's something that I've really been thinking about in the context of my research and making sure that we're trying to design my project around the idea of keystone species, and who defines keystone species and who benefits. And then Derek, a lot of what you said was I read stuff about it during my comp, so there's a lot of things that went on. One of the questions I had was like, do we all need to learn how to fail better? I guess the way the university system is set up is for success, but I found that from my past experiences, I've learned a lot from failing, and that's helped me a lot. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, so thank you all the panelists for a great talk. Just to start, as Dr. Matt said in the beginning, I come from a civil engineering background, and then a small scale fisheries 2 years before it was completely unknown to me. Right? So, like knowing about small scale fisheries, and then the problems being faced by small scale fisheries communities, and then all of these talks of governance and global changes are completely new to me. So I didn't know these communities, like they were here and there, they were facing a lot of these problems, right? So it's completely very new to me, and it's like amazing to know this, these things going on in this part of the world. I just want to highlight some concepts like just related to my research. I just want to kind of bring in the concept that most of the studies that are being conducted in the past, they either focus on the studies just related to vulnerabilities or just related to viability assessment. What I think is we need kind of a combined approach which focuses on the factors related to vulnerability as well as the factors related to viability. So what I mean to say is we need a kind of combined approach that looks at vulnerability and viability together, not as a different aspect, because if we look at a different aspect, we might need another study that connects the dot between these two studies, right? So I just think we just need to incorporate everything right together and conduct a holistic kind of study, and that is where we need this kind of frameworks, like kind of adapt framework, where we can kind of collect the information related to vulnerabilities as well as the information related to the viabilities, right? So that is the point I would like to make. And just to follow up with Dr. Chiampan's talk, the idea related to the state of viability, like the state of viability is not static, right? It will change. For example, if today I'm feeling well, tomorrow I might not feel well. So that will be the same response to fisheries. So what I feel is the current studies that are being done, they are mostly being focused these days just to understand the responses. Okay, these are the responses that are being that are being followed to deal with global changes. But the problem is that no appraisal is being done. No appraisal is being done to identify whether those responses were good enough to deal with changes. Were they successful or were they unsuccessful? So if we don't know whether they were successful or they were unsuccessful, so in that case it might be difficult to kind of formulate the future plans if we don't know whether the past plans were successful or unsuccessful, right? So the appraisal component is kind of missing in vulnerability viability study. So I think we might have to focus more on that. So I just have a common question to all the panelists. I just feel that kind of the adaptation studies related to vulnerability to viability, again related to methodologies. I just feel we might need a different methodology related to the studies related to transitioning small scale fisheries from vulnerability to viability and transforming small scale fisheries from vulnerability to viability. But I want to highlight here is that concept of transition is not as same as the concept of transformation, right? So I just feel we might need separate approaches to deal with transitioning and deal with transformation of small scale fisheries. So I just want to hear. here is this food pantry, so this is all for now.
Thank you. You guys are becoming very soft on your bruise. So you're supposed to challenge them. Okay. Okay, Ruan, let's hear your perspectives.
So thank you for the opportunity. It's really good to be here. Not good like great, the greatest thing to be here with a global scholar in small scale fisheries. So I'm compared to Bhavishya, my background is completely opposite. So mine everything is related to fisheries. So my undergraduate fisheries and then master's in fisheries and another master's in fisheries and now PhD fisheries, small scale fisheries. And myself, like when I was young, I used to do a lot of fisheries stuff as well. So I've been in touch with fisheries lot of stuff. So the my first point is social view, which is one of the things that I have seen in my country when I grew up and still now. When I was studying fisheries back in my home country during undergraduate and master's program, I hardly could introduce myself that I'm a fisheries student because people will say like, oh, you are studying fisheries. Is this something that you need to study? It's just go outside and fish and sell to the market. If someone wants to get profit from it, then just go and sell it. That's it. You don't need to study 4 years for small like fishery stuff, right? So this kind of stuff, even now, if I say that I'm studying PhD in fisheries and fishing communities in Canada, they will be like, oh, you don't have anything to do. You went to Canada to study fisheries, and then what are you going to do with this stuff? So as Ratan was mentioning, that participation of small scale fishers and fishing communities in decision making is important. I also feel like it is also important to change the view of the people. Maybe it's not the case everywhere. In global north, maybe it's a different case, but in global south, the countries like Bangladesh, where I'm from, maybe they have the same thing in some stages. So we need to change that view as a social view. And it's not something that you can do overnight. It will take a long time to change people's perspective, how they think about small scale fishing and fisheries and fishermen. So this is one thing, and I would like to ask like all these panelists and speakers how we can make this, or one of the way, or few ways we can make this social view change to the people. And then the second thing was, Jessica was talking about the national fishing companies deciding fisheries or dominated areas, fisheries so dominated areas in our exploitation. So I have done a couple of studies on market fisheries back in my country. So I have seen there are like hardly any fishing companies or large fish hatcheries that is owned by local people, which is if I go back to the market fishery, like back in 1990 or early 2000, there was nobody who was interested in market fishery. But once it gets highly demanded in the international market, people get started involved in this fishery. And now there are a lot of hatcheries in one part of Bangladesh, it's called Sundarban areas. It's a mangrove forest. And there are many fish farm, they which is called fattening process. So I don't want to go through this process. So my main message is that there are companies which is not only fishing people, fishing local people. They are like industries. They're coming from outside. They're just using it and using people from there, and they are getting benefited. But the people who belongs to these resources, they are not getting anything. Just maybe daily income, and in some cases, the wages are not like very high. Maybe $2, $3 per day for their income. And another thing is, and I was talking about unpredictability in COVID-19. So we have seen from the pandemic, there were hardly any long-term response from the government or maybe from the community. There were a few cases that they have done something very well. For example, in India, I have seen that people have developed their community marketing, something like that. But from the government, they were focusing on short-term benefit. Saving life was the first priority, of course, this is should be, but there were other responses from the government which was not for long term. So they were mainly focusing on short term, and of course, the political in global south, I would say, government more focused on how to motivate people, like in like doing something they can see immediate output. So they want to do this stuff as well, and. I have a few other ones, but I don't have that much of time I need to talk. So I will just go to Derek's management stuff. So I don't know how successful this management is. in terms of the participation of communities in decision making. Because I have seen some papers and some articles where people could have participated. Like, for example, if they want to make any decision, they need everyone participation in the meeting, right? So maybe people from the government side, people from the NGO, they can come and join the meeting. But for small scale fishers, how they can join? If there is no compensation for them, can they join the meeting? If they join the meeting, then they will lose the income for that day because there is no weekend for them. For government, for non-government stakeholders, they have weekend, they have even they miss out their office, they can have their salaries. But for fishing people, if they don't have any compensation or anything, they cannot cover their days loss if they participate in meeting. And there are few other points as well about co-management. So I would just ask this question to the director. Is it something also management need to overcome? Yeah, so that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruel. The important point that you mentioned about social attitude and perceptions and views are so important to our work. I remember in 2010, I wrote a paper on fishers' perceptions about change that is taking place. And one of the metaphors I used to collect, that I collected from the community was Mother Chilica. Chilica is the lagoon that I work. Mother Chilica is crying. And then we talk to people and to kind of, unravel it to understand the Mother Chilica or the lagoon is crying because of its ill health, because there is lots of degradation that has taken place. But also Mother Chilica is crying because all the fishers' sons and daughters and grandchildren are suffering. So I published a paper in 2010. Until now, my friends who do not do fisheries, they laugh at me. They said, "You're spending money on flying to a conference to present Mother Chilica is crying." So social view and social perceptions are so important to what we do and how we engage in the context of our work. So wonderful, lots of good points and perspectives. So we'll stop on this side and we'll move on to the other side now. And I will invite questions and further reflections from our audience here and create a kind of a discussion and interaction that is so important to what we do. Yes, please. Go ahead, please.
Great insights, everyone. I loved how you all took a slightly different angle and put it together. Yeah, that's great. So my question is about your perspectives or your kind of feelings around the small-scale fisheries guidelines and the role that maybe plays in this shift from vulnerability to viability and from the different countries that in context you work in. Those guidelines have been sort of brought on and are being implemented in very different stages in different countries. So is there any sort of early signs that implementing those guidelines is helping that shift? And yeah,
You're talking about the voluntary guidelines for security responsibilities. The idea about the guidelines, of course, came from the small scale fisheries. When we think about the guidelines, also that it has terms of principles, 13 different principles. The first one is tenure rights and respect of culture. So you think about it, it's a consensus agreement. Every word in there has been negotiated and agreed. But because it's voluntary, by nature, member state can choose to do anything with it. So Canada has signed on. Canada was actually the country that was standing in between the adoption of the guidelines in the first round, and then eventually agreed, and later signed on as a friend of small scale fisheries. So what does it mean when you have the government saying that? So many countries around the world recognize that small scale fisheries play a very important role to the economy. They really are not a minority. They actually contribute to the income, employment, job, food security, and poverty alleviation. Countries in the north are a little bit like, well, I don't know, maybe they're actually not that important. In fact, they have been disappearing soon. So we're talking Europe, and many places in Canada. So the attitude of countries are very different depending on how they see where small-scale fisheries sit basically to the population. So countries choose to implement guidelines according to a couple of things, right? First, the importance of small-scale fisheries, and secondly, because even though it's mandatory, it's not mandatory, there is some legal aspect to it that you can still implement it if you are willing to do that. So countries are working to making a little bit of analysis of their whole policy and legislation to see the alignment between what they are already doing, whether it's aligning or not with the principles and guidelines. Many countries, interestingly, are actually finding a lot of evidence, more than missing one, except when you go on human rights. But then it's not only about fisheries law or fisheries regulations that are needed here. It's about a broader set of regulations. So even though in your Fisheries Act, in your regulations may not make reference to human rights, there will be other legislation in your constitution, in your, in the way the government works, in the rule of law, that would suggest that we still need to respect that. So if countries are working in that regard, they actually the idea, of course, is that we are able to follow the guidelines and the principles that are in some of the guidelines. We should indeed see the shift from fundamental. But it is still somewhat early. It has been implemented or endorsed for 5 years, 7 years in some cases. So we will be assessing actually in this upcoming Committee on Fisheries meeting, that's happening. And of course, being that this is an international fisheries center. So we are really looking at how well we do. Really first government endorse, adopted, and try to work to integrate principles in the small scale fisheries guidelines in that way. And then see by doing that, how we actually see change.
Okay, other questions?
I kind of want to go back to Jess's provocation at the beginning about ditching vulnerability and focusing on viability, or comments follow up about problem orientation to a solution orientation. And the comment, both those comments really just resonated with me. In payment for past sins, I've become responsible for administering curriculum now, dealing with mastery programs. And one of the things I hear from students all the time, I'm tired of hearing terror stories. What they want to focus on is success. They want to think about bright lights. They want to think about the future. They want to think about solutions. And so I'm wondering if the challenge that we put out for us is more than just about focus on this project. It's about academia. Right? How do we transform ourselves to think not only our research, but our curriculum, our design, our training, so that we're doing that better. Right? The point is to train students better than what they do. So I don't know if that's a comment or a question, but I kind of wanted to throw that back to you and ask, is that provocation go deeper than this?
Thank you for that comment. I wasn't thinking of it in that context, but what you say resonates with all of us. We're all not in the room, and I think the like overwhelming weight of all of the crises, and any academic paper you pick up talks of like the converging crises of overfishing, climate change, blah blah. So I love the idea to challenge ourselves to think about it in context, so not just the fisheries research that we do, but it's all. And just anecdotally, that resonates. And clearly, there's figures, and I'm going too far in one direction to be sort of troublesome for the purposes of the panel. It's disorders, but yeah, we there's definitely value in the need for positivity, and the ideas of a lot of the scenarios research that's coming up now, and need for positive scenarios and working towards something you can actually see, and a lot of like great work coming out of like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez teamed up with Naomi Klein to make that message from the future video, and she's like, we don't see, if we don't have hope and visions for the future, then how can we work towards them? So I like that, I was thinking about it in the context. Brainstorming that space, I see a lot of value.
Well, in the policy space, you mentioned too, right? Like, if your policy maker is tired, no problem.
You know, usually people like to, you know, I usually call them even an optimist, but actually a very good way to be an optimist is actually to start from a very negative perspective. If Natasha said that we should learn from failures, yeah, you know, we jump in way too quickly to be trying to be happy, for no good reason. I'm sorry. I mean, think about it, right? I mean, life is about suffering. And we should just live with that for a little bit and see how. I really want.
But in the context of the complexity of small scale fisheries, I think there's a danger of trying to understand things too quickly, to move away from challenges that we do confront. Anthropologists, that actually have difficult challenges of trying to understand too quickly. And there's no problem with this. And I remember doing some work in the context of Vietnam and complexity of just the property rates and rights allocations in that living system that take decades to truly understand. And never could, and not based there. So I think there's that challenge. I like this, of course, in the optimism, and absolutely agree with you from a curriculum standpoint. But I think there's an accountability issue as well. I think we need to be thinking carefully about our accountabilities for some of these challenges and who's responsible for EU. I don't think we can have that conversation about accountability, responsibility, without being a bit open and honest about what the problems are. So, yeah, I mean, I like the conversation.
I respectfully counter.
Yes.
I love what you said, obviously, and I'm arguing probably just for the sake of it, but I think that what you said that resonated most with me is who gets to define vulnerability. And so my provocation of, I'm just calling them social scientists, but largely outsiders to the community, I'm calling on us to be careful with the word vulnerability. Because I think too, we're coming out of the international development sector where I read, it was in one of the really epic books like Liberation Apologies or one of those, where a little boy in Malawi said, I didn't realize I was underdeveloped until people came and told me I was underdeveloped. So I'm urging caution around our outside use of the word vulnerability because it is so, it implies a lot and you know, the words carry. I really see, but I love that question, like who is to define it? And then thusly, like how can I ever understand the complexity of a place to which I don't belong? So yeah, shifting who's gets to make all these decisions and then what is my small role in sort of amplifying those things.
In the comment from the elder this morning at the end of the session, the final, speaks its volume about what is needed to be done. And that in that context, the provocation about moratorium really is relevant. Probably not saying that there should be a moratorium on a continuous process of understanding vulnerability, but a moratorium on who should be doing it. So maybe hinting at scientists or people external to the context, getting too much engaged and excited, and being happy, as Zatan was saying, about bringing change, which they don't understand. So the moratorium question is very relevant in that kind of understanding. But as we also heard from other panelists, this is a continuous process. Of course, we're dealing with a dynamic system situation. And it doesn't allow us kind of to say, okay, here is a perfect understanding of either vulnerability or viability issues, because it's going to change anytime. So that in that context, I understand your emphasis on moratorium from that point of view. Yeah. Okay. I think we have a very good time. Yes, please, Josh.
This is a very interesting panel, of course, and conversation. So a couple of comments. One is about vulnerability. We heard this morning from Tony Doyle that certainly
harvesters in this country, and as the case elsewhere, they feel that they're vulnerable. And it feels that it is working at a disadvantage. Fisheries in general feel that they're the only ones who can lose when there's protected areas or proposals for wind farms or something. There's no place left to go but down. So there is a context in which I know how the fisheries feel about. But I wonder if I was wondering as we were talking about whether that is the right, we're asking the right question, and what it is we're really trying to achieve. We talk a lot about this conference. I know it is the theme of this conference about getting small-scale fisheries governance right. But is it about small-scale fisheries governance or about governance in general? And we need to look at what's trying to preserve small-scale fisheries and what for. Is it to perpetuate something just because it's there? Or might we turn this around and say, what are we after? Surely we're after a very adaptable, vibrant fishery, rooted in community, with benefits to Canadian society. And if we did that, what would be the model that we would choose? I bet, and I will propose tomorrow, that if we did that, I bet we would look at a lot of the attributes that are of small-scale fisheries, such as an international view. I bet you we would conclude that we want more of that than we have right now. I think that might be a strategic advantage to the small-scale fishery argument if we're looking for that. Does that resonate?
I totally agree. I think part of the way I approached this panel discussion was thinking about shifting narratives around small-scale fisheries, and that's what this whole partnership is about, and that's what you're saying, I think, is that there's so much functional, historic knowledge and ways of doing that are not widely known and are not widely celebrated that could be lessons of learning from. There's been tons of failure. There's been tens of thousands of years of failure that communities have adapted along the way. And so elevating all of those experiences and historical ways of fishing are, to me, is like a really exciting, promising way forward. And I agree with you that if we looked at models of governance, nobody in this conference anyway would say what we want is more corporate power, more money going out of the communities. What we want is a lot of the characteristics that are found in small scale. So to me, that seems very exciting and promising, and it's sort of the optimistic spin that I find very inspiring.
Now, if we agree, just like you said, everybody tends to agree that whatever picture, whatever characteristics of the fisheries, it should align more with what we see of small-scale fisheries. But why is it that we don't have a lot of policies, a lot of regulations that are really supporting and providing opportunities for small-scale fisheries to be viable? Because for the most part, it's the opposite that is happening. So I would argue actually that regardless of what we think we like, we act the opposite, because the people who make the decision, or at least the people who influence people who make decision, are the ones who hold all the power. And that's small-scale fisheries picture. It's not what they practice. So what do you do? So we turn that to grants and the students figure it out.
Yeah, thanks.
No, you wanted to take some action and be looking into positive space, right? How do you deal with people who think, or actually who hold power, even though there is no legitimacy and no urgency in their demands and their concerns. How do you take away that? And if you want to go back to the scientists has the language. And most of the time, we actually also. And this is why I'm a little bit like, we still need to continue to provide narrative and tell stories and talk about this. Because we can't just not walk away with it by not talking about it, it's just gonna go away. It is not. Vulnerability is not going away. Viability is not gonna happen because we talk about it either. But what we need to talk about is how to deal with a country like Canada. That happens to be a place where people seem to be happy. But for some reason or another, there's one or two people making decisions about what's happening in Canada or what's happening in fisheries. You know how many international students are hearing that the minister has all the power? And they're like, I know it doesn't translate literally, but at the same time, we're talking about the structure of decision-making process that actually favors certain kind of power and influence decisions. And we heard that this morning, people who should be part of decision-making never really have access to it. They really think it should be. How do we deal with that? So many of you are government. So you can answer that.
And the fact that small scale, the vulnerabilities that we're talking about is not only resulting from fisheries, because people's lives are not compartmentalized. So the sources of vulnerability could be outside, fisheries, and could be a reality in their other interactions, in the social, cultural, and other domains. So it is not about fisheries in the small scale. Fisheries vulnerability or fishers vulnerability, because these are human beings, these are societies that revolve around multiple other things in addition to fish. So and that changes the narrative itself. How many types of stories and on what you need to tell, is a question itself. We have 5 minutes, and if there are no pressing questions or reflections from the audience, I'd like to take the last 5 minutes to go in the same order, 30 seconds to each to hear again the same question. What is your final word or a reflection on vulnerability to viability, given the discussion that just took place?
30 seconds. I think we need more good news stories about small scale fisheries in order to get their incredible strengths onto the radar of the public, for example. This morning we saw a clip of the awful documentary, or the capture of that Seaspiracy documentary, which did so much damage to the fisheries sector. And I think the public thinks of fisheries in a negative, but there's so many positives. And I love the story from Super Auto this morning, where all of the people who were involved petitioned the government to change a rule that was hurting small scale fishers. So in my perspective, good news stories about the strengths and benefits of small scale fisheries to put pressure to shift decision making.
Stay positive while learning from the failures.
So in the same line, to understand that vulnerability and viability are not separate concepts, but they're actually intertwined. And vulnerabilities can bring opportunities to think about viability once we are in this problem-solving space. So think about understanding vulnerabilities, taking them into consideration, but in a way that can think about what are the viabilities that emerge from specific vulnerabilities. This is the main takeaway.
Yeah, that's great. Vulnerabilities can lead to viability, and viability can lead to
You want to 10 seconds, because I can give you.
yeah, we have 30 seconds to review.
No, I mean, I could just give them 40 seconds.
Yeah, so I think transition from vulnerability to viability is not something that's gonna like completely happen. Maybe we can address few issues, few vulnerabilities, or maybe 90%, like 50% is 80%, 90% we can cover. But I believe there will be further vulnerabilities. So if I talk about from Anna's point of view of well-being, we think like something that make people now unhappy. But once they have it, will they be really happy? They may have further desire, they may have further obstruction, further problems, which will make them further vulnerable, something new. So we have to think about viability again. So I think it's a process which will go on, but we can, as a researcher, we can find out the solution, we can deal with these problems and analyze it, and then make something that make them happy for the time being, or we can have a solution for the time being, but it's not for good, I would say. Yeah.
Great perspective. Need to be in the process. Yeah. Ramesh?
So, just because we want small scale fisheries, they are like socio-ecological systems and they are dynamic, right? So there will always be vulnerabilities as well as there, and then we need to look for the perspective of viabilities. And itself, the concept of vulnerability viability is like we look at the inherent strength of the fishing community, right? So I think we just always don't need to think that small scale fisheries communities are vulnerable, but I think we need to just not always think of giving them more incentives or more kind of those things, but we might have to kind of deal with kind of love, care, more of those kind of things.
I think for me, it's just like understanding like the context more, and that like a one size fits all approach doesn't work. And like a historical perspective is really.
I'm going to take 15 back to my small scale, viable small scale fisheries in my mind are place based, and that's the place connection. It's so important. That so many people in Canada are disconnected from places. We from demographic deficit. I think it's going to make it very challenging to move forward.
Well, people said, the word is transition, and then somebody asked, are we also talking transformation? I would say revolution.
Yeah. Wonderful. We are at time, and I always look at vulnerability and viability, in terms of using me. So you wake up in the morning, and then you reflect. Yesterday, how many times I have felt vulnerable, in what kind of situations, and how many times I felt, quote unquote viable or happy, or it provides some answers. And I see the same kind of reflection when working in the communities. So it is not constant, as has been already emphasized. So there are moments, there are moments when you feel extremely vulnerable. There are moments you can feel extremely viable. There are moments you feel, yes, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So you're still vulnerable, but you can see that you can get viable given these conditions are made. So there are multiple things that make up this transition that we are kind of thinking, and we are thinking it on behalf of 150 or more individuals that are part of this network, and we're just beginning to search, and we'll continue to do that. And thank you very much for all your contributions, of course, to the panelists, all of you, and a big round of applause to them. And thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to the graduate students. Good job.